Welcome back, boxing fans, to Sean on Boxing. So I was just listening to Punch Drunk, and I barely ever agree with anything he has to say. And today, of course, was no different. But he did bring up one thing, and it does resonate to a point that I do think this truthfully sells in America. He was talking about doing American version of the 5-on-5. But what he was talking about, even in jest, was black versus brown. Black Americans versus Latinos. And having this card brought to you by Saudi Arabia, Turkey Al-Sheikh, obviously wanting great fights. Here is your platform to making great fights. And using race as the predominant selling point towards this. Obviously you're going to get black Americans interested in it, wanting to see them showcase and prove their superiority. And obviously then you have the Latino boxing fans, who are obviously a strong group in the States, who are going to want to see their Latino brothers represent. So based on that, you can understand that this would be a huge selling point. Huge, right? And the fights he mentioned are obviously all top fights, so it's no surprise. When we talk about Turkey Al-Sheikh, though, the reality is these fights, truthfully, can be done. And we know that two of the fights already mentioned are already fights that were pre-planned anyways. So you're not really going out on a limb. You're basically talking about two fights that we've already heard Turkey Al-Sheikh talking about as a big fight coming up in the future. So you just add a few more fights to round out that card, and you get what would be an unbelievable card. In truth, it's a much better card even than the card we just had in California, and that was a great card, and it worked out great as well. I mean, you talk about upsets, you talk about close fights, that's what a great card is. A great card is when matchmaking ends up making fights that you can't truly predict, and we end up getting tons of upsets and fight outputs that surprise everybody, even hardcore boxing fans. And we did get some of that, even though people were talking about that there was obviously a risk of some of those fights ending up that way. But let's look at the fights he mentioned, and you can feel free to leave your opinion in the comment section below. And are there any other black versus Latino fights that you think potentially could also potentially be put on this card? I don't think I would see Turkey Al-Sheikh push a card like this specifically with the whole racial component. But obviously, I understand what Punch Drunk is saying. The whole racial atmosphere on the YTBC has historically been a huge issue. You look at most of the big channels on YouTube, and primarily what they are race-based channels that consistently push racial narratives day in and day out. So I get where he's coming from. I totally get it. I can't imagine a card actually being made like that. But talk about like the hostility you potentially could build up in the crowd, right? Which obviously this whole racial component could end up moving into the crowd and turning out to be not really what any boxing promoter would want, right? Obviously you wouldn't want the fights happening outside the ring. You want them happening inside the ring. If you want to prove your masculinity or superiority, then bet on your fighters, walk away with shitloads of cash, or end up betting on your fighters and lose fucking the house, right? That ultimately will be the final test. You can get rich from supporting your own, or you could potentially fucking lose your shirt. But obviously the main event, and this is not a surprise, this is a fight that people are obviously talking about and speculating about, and that would be obviously a Bud Crawford WBA world title fight versus Virgil Ortiz, the interim WBC champion, which in this case doesn't really mean much because obviously he's not the legitimate champion. That would be Funduro. But this was the fight Turkey Al-Sheikh was talking about wanting to make. Obviously many of us feel the only reason that Virgil Ortiz ended up winning that fight against his last opponent, the Ukrainian fighter, is because this fight was already scheduled and they didn't want that to end up losing out because of a surprising upset of this nature. So that would be a great fight, but I think anyone being realistic understands that Bud Crawford beats Virgil Ortiz. Clearly. Virgil Ortiz had a chance to fight Bud Crawford for his WBO title at 147. He blatantly ducked him to chase after a fucking minor title with the WBA. He moved up not because he wanted to, but because of health issues. And now, of course, because a man with big money is trying to perpetuate this fight, now there's a big push towards this fight being made. But you know that as far as Virgil Ortiz's camp, this is not really the direction they want to go. We know what direction they want to go. They want to fight the winner of Funduro Spence. It's a big money fight, but less risk. Obviously, Funduro's already been beaten. He's a limited fighter. Errol Spence looks like he's fucking shot and isn't really going to bring much to the ring. So that's a smart direction. And then you also have the potential fight with Tim Tszyu for unification. All of these in-house PBC fights. So most of us expect that it's going to move in this direction. But if this fight was able to be made and materializes, I would pick Bud Crawford to stop Ortiz sometime after the 8th round. And I think it would be quite the ass whooping. But let me know in the comment section what you think. As far as the second fight that was listed, let me quickly open my iPad. Of course, this guy has to be on a fucking Punch Drunk fucking video. And that is Teofimo Lopez, who obviously was talking about and calling out Brian Norman, his top rank promoted fighter, right? A guy that makes a lot of sense because it's obviously two fighters, an in-house fight. He's the WBO champion, meaning he could easily move up to 147 pounds and become the mandatory for Brian Norman's WBO title. So it's a no-brainer. It's a typical kind of thing you see with top rank working through the WBO. So it's a fight that you could easily see happening. And we know that Lopez was name-dropping and throwing out Brian Norman, even though Brian Norman is not the kind of guy you clout chase off of because he doesn't really have any real fan base at this point anyways, because he's just a young guy who just surprisingly won a world title. But without a lot of big name fighters currently at 140 pounds, it would make sense for Teo to move up to 147 and try to become a 3-weight world champion, which in itself is pretty historic. Beating Brian Norman, an undefeated world champion, to do that, potentially putting himself in line for fights with Stanionis, Boots, and Barrios, even though I can't imagine Teo taking on any of those opponents. So the fight makes sense in that it is an in-house fight, that Teo did talk about fighting him, did name drop him, but most recently we heard that he was offered the fight and he walked away from it because in truth he knows Brian Norman is too big and too tough of a fight. Even though he may not be as skilled as Teo's going to be the smaller man. He's going to be giving up power, size, and really any advantage he really brings into the ring. So I think Brian Norman beats the snot out of him. I don't know if Brian Norman stops him, but I definitely know he puts a fucking ass whooping on him and sends his ass back down to 140 pounds. And it definitely would be a true wake-up call for Teo. So, I don't see it happening because we know Teo blatantly just ducked that fight. But if it was to be made, because the money was put on the table that makes it worthwhile, and he was given sort of a, well, if you beat Brian Norman, then a possible fight with you and Bud Crawford, if he beats Virgil Ortiz, is definitely going to be the next fight on one of our Saudi cards. The two winners from the top two fights matching up, you trying to become a 4-weight world champion, fighting a pound-for-pound top 1, 2, or 3 fighter in Bud Crawford, right? Maybe that would be the onus to push Teo towards a potential fight with Brian Norman, kind of like when he fought Comey to earn a fight with Lomachenko. But I definitely think Brian Norman beats him. I just think Brian Norman, volume, aggressiveness, resilience, the dog that he showed in his last performance. Obviously, I think Teo is better than Santillan, to be honest. Better footwork, better technical fighter. He's just more versatile than Santillan. But I also think Brian Norman is going to be better after becoming a champion, because we know generally guys improve once they become champions. Work harder, obviously more confident, and a lot of this resonates, especially with young guys like this. And we know skill-wise, Brian Norman was always seen as a very good fighter. The problem was his inconsistency. Then, the third fight on this card would be a fight that I was asking for. Keyshawn Davis, another top-ranked fighter. So far you got 2 top-ranked cards on this undercard, so something that truly could be made, because we know that Top Rank did just sign an agreement with Saudi Arabia, so these fights are definitely things that can be made. And because it's not being promoted by Top Rank, that's not going to alienate Bud Crawford from being the headliner on this card. But that would be Keyshawn Davis versus Raymond Muratalla. Obviously, we know that Keyshawn's a very good fighter, young, up-and-comer, shows great skill set, has been moved really well, and I thought he would be chasing that WBO world title versus the Ukrainian fighter. That made a lot of sense, and maybe that will be the direction he moves, because we know that some other plans have been sort of changed, so that means the door for him potentially fighting for that vacant WBO title, which is a normal direction Top Rank moves, is potentially there for him. But if that fight doesn't happen, then a possible Raymond Muratalla fight would be great. Muratalla is a come-forward, very aggressive fighter, which could only really highlight and showcase Keyshawn Davis's skill set. I definitely think Keyshawn is way too good for Raymond Muratalla, but Raymond's an aggressive, exciting fighter who's going to make a great fight. And for a guy like Keyshawn, being involved in a great fight is a good thing. It helps build his name, makes him more marketable, and definitely propels him forward in his career. And I think Muratalla is that kind of opponent he needs to sort of get that attention. You'd rather move in that direction as opposed to Shakur Stevenson's most recent fights, which have kind of sapped a lot of fandom away from him. So I'd love to see that fight. I think it'd be great, and I'm definitely picking Keyshawn to win. So far, based on this black versus brown card from Saudi Arabia, according to Punch Drunk Boxing, I got the 3 black fighters winning every single fight. The most likely fight potentially that could see a brown guy win is probably Tio versus Norman, because Norman is young and inexperienced. So the guy that potentially could utilize his skill set and experience probably would be Tio. I just don't see that happening. But he would be the one guy that I could give more of a lean towards. And he has really stepped up in his biggest fights. So if he could do it in this case, that would be pretty fucking monumental. Then number 4, of course, we know that the Saudis love the big guys, and we just had them on a card. He suggested Big Baby Anderson, coming off of his first career loss, a brutal stoppage where he got battered and beaten against a guy that I said, don't be surprised if Anderson loses, because I said that that guy's a very good fighter, and his only loss coming to Hunter a few years ago, and he's definitely become a better fighter because of that. He's improved, gotten better, and we definitely saw that against Big Baby Anderson. And the perfect opponent for him on this black versus brown card would be Andy Ruiz, who obviously is coming off of a draw and a less than stellar performance of his own. And to be fair, I know some people might jump at Andy Ruiz as the easy guy to pick in a potential fight like this, especially knowing that Big Baby did get knocked out in his last performance. But stylistically, this is a very, very different opponent. Not a tall opponent with a long reach and devastating power. Andy Ruiz is a very short, diminutive fighter with short arms. He's not going to be able to, stay on the outside, controlling distance behind the jab, throwing big bombs down the middle. that's not the way he's going to be successful against a guy like Baby Anderson, right? So I think this is a great bounce back fight for Anderson. Obviously, there is risk involved because you're fighting an ex-world champion, unified champion, a good fighter who's never really been dominated and destroyed in his career. But I think stylistically, this is kind of the perfect opponent for Anderson. I think his speed, his size advantage and length advantage, his punch output, all of these things would really make this a great performance from him, where really he could look great against a guy like Ruiz. Ruiz is going to take it. He's going to come forward. He's going to be an aggressive fighter who keeps trying all night. I just don't know if he's going to be able to get inside and be successful. So I think this is a great fight. I would love to see this as a bounce back fight for Anderson. I know Anderson lost, but I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, great fighters have lost in their career. The guy that beat him, Bacoli, he'd lost before too, getting stopped against Hunter, a guy who wasn't even a hard puncher. I think it was a stoppage, or did it go the distance? I can't remember off the top of my head, but let me know. And we've seen countless fighters who've come through hurdles, improved and learned from them, and used that experience to move on to be better fighters in the future. So I definitely think this might be the perfect wake-up call for Anderson, and I think Ruiz might be the perfect opponent. So I'm leaning towards Anderson to win this fight over Ruiz. Obviously, Ruiz is a good fighter, experienced. Technically he's a good fighter, not to be dismissed. And obviously, after getting 2 years of ring raw stuff, being in a really tough fight like he was just in, maybe we'll see a very different version of Andy Ruiz. That's also possible. But nonetheless, it's a super exciting fight, nonetheless, and I would be keen for it. Then the next fight he had is Xander Zayas versus Erickson Luben. And I know Luben's been looking for big fights, even though he's been walking away from them. And Xander Zayas is gradually being moved forward in his career as well. This is kind of the perfect opportunity for Xander Zayas. He's in with a very good fighter. Dangerous, right? But yet a guy who is beatable and has been beaten several times by different kind of fighters. The question is, has Xander Zayas matured enough where he's going to be able to utilize his technical proficiency to beat not a rugged, but a very good, experienced, dangerous fighter like Erickson Luben? I think it's a very good opponent. I would be excited by this fight. I think it's a great matchup. For Luben, he might not like this fight because it seems more of a step back as opposed to the step forward. But he's not really in a position right now to act like he's the A-side. This is a guy who, coming off of his win versus Ramos, literally has done nothing except moan and groan about deserving a world title fight. Yet when he gets big money fights, he ends up walking away from those on 2 occasions versus Tim Tszyu. So, I think he should just take this fight if it was offered to him. Obviously, if it was part of the Saudi card, the money would be right. And if you beat Xander Zayas on a Saudi card, it just means you're going to potentially get bigger fights moving forward. Maybe even a potential Bud Crawford fight, right? And then, of course, the last fight on this card, and not the least, I don't think it would be the last, it would probably be the second, maybe third card fight on this card if it was done. And that would be Keyshawn Davis defending his WBC title versus William Sepeda. And this is a great fight. You can see that I've been leaning towards the black fighters all night. And this is just because I'm a boxing fan. And when I look at boxing, I look at it from a rational, realistic perspective. I don't let race determine who I'm going to pick. I let my picks get based on matchups, style, and how well people have been fighting recently. And this is how I also look at this fight. I think Sepeda is a very exciting fighter. Excuse me. I like him a lot. Um, but I also know that Shakur is a great fighter who potentially could be transcendental, transformative, but potentially he could be the pound for pound number one fighter in the sport of boxing. But he also has to continue to be better. And I definitely think Sepeda is going to push him and force him to be at his best. Sepeda in his volume, aggressive come forward style is the kind of style that could potentially beat a fighter like Shakur. So he definitely has to be on his P's and Q's. But we do know that there's levels to this shit. Just because you're a aggressive come forward fighter doesn't mean you're necessarily going to beat a slick boxer strictly because of the style matchup. There's levels to this. Potentially, you could just be opening the front door for what could be Keyshawn Davis's, best performance of his career. The one that, labels him a superstar. Kind of like Floyd Mayweather versus Corrales, right? It could be a similar type of situation to that. So I'd have to lean towards Shakur in this fight as well. But I do obviously think it's very close. A pretty 50-50 fight. I would have to maybe say 55-45 for Shakur. But, Zepeda's definitely right in it. I would not be surprised to see Sepeda win the fight. But overall, this is a great card. I do think the Black American fighters would win in this particular setup. Not because one race is dominant and better than the other race. It's just styles make fights. And with these styles and these fights, I have to favor the Black American fighters in almost every single case. Obviously, I see a few situations where the Latino fighter could win. Lopez, Andy Ruiz, and even Sepeda. But, and Xander Zayas as well. So out of 4 of the fights, out of the 6, I definitely think they're competitive. I think Ortiz gets destroyed by Bud Crawford. And I do think that, what was the other one? Oh, and I do think Keyshawn Davis easily beats Raymond Muratalla. So out of those 2 fights, I definitely favor the Black American fighter big. 70-30, maybe even more. But in the other fights, I think it is more competitive, closer fights. Not exactly 50-50, but more competitive fights. I'm just favoring the Black American fighter. Obviously, with Howard, I do think Lopez could potentially beat him, but size, strength, power, the dog that we saw in his last performance, I gotta favor Howard a little bit, right? A little bit. So maybe 55-45. With Ruiz versus Anderson, obviously Anderson's coming off of a knockout loss. You don't know how that's going to affect him mentally. So, I do favor Andy Ruiz by maybe 55-45, maybe 60-40. But I'm hopeful that Anderson could really bounce back and learn. And because the stylistic matchup is way different than he just faced. So, it's a complete different ball game. As I said, I do favor Shakur over Sepeda. So I think it's a great card. If this card did get made from Saudi Arabia, I'd be fucking all over it. I think it's a great card. Some really exciting fights. Obviously fights I'd love to see dudes in with really great competitors. And in these cases, I think they are great competitors. I'm not dismissing, downplaying, or hating on any of these fighters. I think they're all very good. It's just, when you look at things rationally, you gotta break it down and give your opinion based on many different factors, as I have in this video. But let me know in the comment section below Who do you think would win these fights? Do you favor the black or the brown fighters in this particular 5-on-5 type of situation? I know they've talked about these kind of cards, Top Rank versus the PBC, or Top Rank versus Golden Boy. You know, they talked about Americans versus Mexicans, you know, which is pushing a racial narrative, but kind of being a little more non-racial by using it. And I understand you don't want to necessarily be blatantly racist in the formulation of such a fight card. You know, it just might be a bad look, and as I said, it might really bring the wrong kind of crowd and atmosphere to the venue. But we know that really underground, whether you said it or not, this would be something that people would be playing up hardcore, and would obviously be something that would get tons of people's attention from both demographics. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Peace out. Enjoy your weekend, guys.